Hello. Today we're going to talk about ethical reasoning. Yes, ethical reasoning. You've got your book, and we've talked a lot in class about ethics and the law. But what we need is to be able to work things out for ourselves in everyday, everyday situations, basically. Yes, we do. It's important. It's important to be able to reason through ideas and to work out why we value certain things and why we think certain ways about ethics, bioethics. We've got this kind of book as a guide. We've got bioethical principles as a guide. But let's think about what that really means. Let's unpack that a little bit. So I want to be a nurse. Why should I worry about ethics? Well, sometimes we need to ask ourselves big questions. How should I live my life, for example? Or sometimes not so big questions. What should I give my kid for breakfast? I mean, those are kind of everyday ethics for us living our lives. But what about in the clinical situation? Patients want to go home. Families don't want them. What are the ethics in there? How do we look at that? How do we understand what's going on there? Historically, philosophers have disagreed about what actually the basic questions of ethics is. They've thought, could it be an act-orientated approach? How ought I act? Or a person-orientated approach? What sort of person should I try to be? Both big pictures. Let's look at act-orientated approaches. There are two ways to answer this question. Consequentialism, to look at the end result, means justifying the end kind of approach. Which action has the best consequences or no? Immanuel Kant says no, we should follow a set of rules at all times. There are different kinds of consequentialist approaches. Who's important? Whose consequences are we thinking about? Is it everyone? Is it every human being? Is it every sentient being? Is it just me? What yardstick should I use to measure good? Happiness, pleasure, hedonism. Right now, we have different yardsticks when we think about what that means. So taking this to the next level, how would two great philosophers, John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham, answer this question? Well, Mill would say muesli, because they're thinking about the future happiness. Bentham would say, well, Cocoa Pops, because he was a hedonist, and it's all about happiness right now. But that's not the whole story. The good is happiness, and happiness is pleasure. And that's where Bentham was right now for the individual. But Mills was thinking about utilitarianism, the greatest happiness principle for the greatest number. So what about act or rule consequentialism? What does that mean? Do we look at the consequences of each individual act, or do we have general rules to guide human behaviour? And rules-orientated approaches have things in common. They trump consequences, so no matter how much good might be accomplished, you can't break the rules. And we see that in clinical trials. Have a look at the Tuskegee trials on the CDC website. There are different kinds of rule-orientated approaches, and we're used to this in everyday life. Ten Commandments, the Sharia law, human rights, justice, deontology, Immanuel Kant, looking at following the rules regardless of what's happened, whatever the context. But ethical values and beliefs can vary over time. Think about public executions as entertainment, and then medieval Europeans thinking about bombs. What about slavery? How has that changed over time? People have different beliefs and they've changed over time. But beliefs and values ethical beliefs and values can be different in one time. Thinking about polygamy and marriage, abortion and euthanasia, and the variation of thoughts and beliefs around ethical behaviour of those things. So is pluralism okay? Is one right and the other wrong? Or does each part tell the whole story? And what are bioethics? And what are empirical bioethics? We hear this bandied around. Empirical anything is deriving knowledge from experience, and bioethics are about the bioethics in the clinical arena. So what ethical resources can we use in healthcare practice? Because it's so complicated, so complex. Rules-based approach, utilitarianism, and a principle-based approach that will be talked about in more detail. But there's an idea from Gillam about ethical mindfulness, that we're using principles but we're thinking about the individual context, so kind of person-centeredness, so being reflexive and mindful of your own unique space and time and cultural situation, and putting that in the communication with patients, but always guided in healthcare by a principled approach. And if we think about ethical mindfulness in nursing, we've got the individual patient, we've got the 4 principles surrounding that, and that's perhaps how we're guided in our ethical thinking. And so in answering what should I do, we can be ethically mindful and guided by the 4 principles. And wouldn't it be good if Nurse Jackie had been?